And here we are. I'm back in the AVS scripts folder again, and I'll forgive you for not remembering this directory as we've only covered it once or twice. But there's really no excuse at this point for the episode 1 directory. None. Okay, it's C drive, Machinima Cinematography with the source engine, files needed, AVS scripts. And we're going to want to open the file that says xvidmotionblur.avs. Again, any text editor will be fine. Okay, you'll notice there's a lot more to cover on this script than the last one. This will be the motion blur working its magic. There's actually very little you need to change here, but I'll go over all of it for your benefit. Okay, the first line here is load plugin, then a parentheses and quote marks, then a path leading towards the DLL you installed at the beginning. This is important. The rest of this won't work without it. You probably don't need to change anything here. If you install that plugin to the default directory like in the intro, then you should be all right. Okay, next we have source equals. The name here can really be anything. This is actually a form of very basic programming. What we're doing is defining to the script what the word source should mean. This means every time we use the word source after this, it will look at the command we have following it. This saves us the trouble of typing out this mess several more times. In retrospect, I maybe should have picked a different word since we already have the command AVI source. I refer to our source footage, and we're filming in the source engine. Really, I always thought that was a poor name for the engine, actually. Can you imagine how confusing that must be for programmers? Like if somebody said, yeah, I'm working in source. Is he talking about the source engine? His source material? Source code in general? Or the source code to the source engine? Source! Source! Anyway, let's take a look at what follows it. The first command, AVI source, which is thankfully one word, should be familiar. This is the command we used when we were converting the xvid footage. And really, we're going to be doing that here, but with several other steps as well. Okay, next it has the parentheses and quotation marks. And again, we want to point to where your AVI file is located. I've already filled in mine here. Next, I have a period to separate the commands. Then assume FPS 180. This should be whatever frame rate you recorded your footage to blur at. Next, I have another dot. And since I recorded this in xvid, I have that same convert to YV12 command as before. Okay, these next two lines you shouldn't change anything on. They're telling the script to create motion vectors. Even though I say I came up with this method for motion blur, it's really just a simple extra step I was able to deduce after learning the software. The real talent is the person who programmed this DLL to begin with, because that's what's doing all the work here. What these lines are doing are telling the DLL to analyze all the frames in your video, and look at the differences before and after them. Then after figuring out the differences, it uses that to calculate the motion vectors, which is information that records what's moving in your footage. This right here is why this method is superior to the ghosting I showed you earlier. Instead of relying only on the image transparencies, it also uses the motion vector information to fill in the gaps and guess what the blurred image is supposed to look like. Alright, so once the script has the motion vector data, it combines it then blurs the image. That's what this next line does here. This first part is telling it to send the motion vector data back to the plugin, then it's applying a blur to the footage based on those values. Now you may want to pay attention to this value here. The blur equals 100. You can try lowering this number to get less motion blur, but I find you get more of a double image when that happens. You can increase this value up to 200, but that will probably result in having more blur than is natural. Alright, after this I have a period separating the command, then another line saying temporal soften, then several numbers after it in parentheses. What this is doing is adding an additional blur command. This is needed because this DLL isn't actually intended to be used the way I'm using it. It's meant to be used on footage at your default frame rate. Now that would be even more convenient, but the problem with that is that it has to do way more guesswork, and you'll end up with many more visual artifacts with it blurring areas it's not supposed to. Anyway, as for these numbers, the first one is a radius of how many pixels it should blur. If you change that to 0, you'll have significantly less blur. If you change it to 2, you'll have way too much. So you should probably leave it as it is. The next three numbers are just threshold values of what it should or shouldn't blur. Just leave those alone. The last number is specifying a method of how to process it. You can leave that alone too. After that I have another period, and finally the command select every, then a 6, then a 1. This is telling the video to use every 6th frame of your footage, so the end result will be 30 frames per second, since my original footage was 180 frames per second. If you recorded at a higher or lower frame rate, then you would enter in the multiple number here. So if you recorded at 300 frames per second, this would be a 10 instead of a 6. And don't think you're missing important data by skipping frames like this. Believe me, if you didn't do this, your final footage would be a soupy mess. Alright, that covers the motion blur script. Go ahead and save this, then close it, then we'll head over to Virtual Dub for the final step.